/ marker. Canon doesn't explain. Let's call it. There we go. Alright. Cool. So, here's the thing. Space Marines are not clones. Given that... I don't know if cloning is a forbidden technology within the 41st millennium setting. I know that there are some that do it, so... no, it's not... That's a tricky one. I don't know if it is and I don't know if it isn't, because there are characters on both sides of the line, like in various factions, that do experiment with cloning. So for the Forces of Chaos, it is a particular character known as Fabius Bile from the Emperor's Children Legion. He has cloned himself numerous times over the last in-setting 10,000 years. There is the Archmagos Call, who has also cloned himself multiple times. And I don't know if the Necrons technically count as clones just because of reasons, but Space Marines are not clones. Space Marines are the prepubescent sons of whatever planet a chapter decides to basically make their home, unless they are a void-faring chapter. I'm so glad I don't have a camera on right now. My wife is making funny faces at me because I'm being a nerd. So void-faring chapters are obviously different. They just pick their replenishments from wherever they happen to be at the time. All right, so aspirants is what they're called. They're usually about 8-9 years of age. Very nice. Whereupon they are tested and tried. Now, keep in mind there are several points of failure for a Space Marine before they become a Space Marine. One is obviously they have to they have to be picked for starters, and they have to, in some cases, part of the trial is to get to where the Space Marine chapter has set up the base, their fortress monastery. So in the case of the Blood Angels, their whole trial is to survive basically the planet that the Blood Angels have set up shop on. For the Ultramarines, it's a little bit different, purely because of where the chapter was founded. So for these guys, it's a little bit different. We'll just kind of do... I don't want to get too deep into it because reasons. So aspirants obviously have to either make it to the Fortress Monastery or be chosen by chaplains, I guess. I was thinking... I'll respond to that in a second, Osai. So once they make it to... Once they're picked, they then undergo, like, a shitload of surgery. An absolute shitload of surgery. Okay? And so they get various organs implanted into them. Least notwithstanding is something called gene seed, which is basically their Primarch's own genetics, whoever that Primarch happens to be. Right? So for the Ultramarines is a guy by the name of Reboot Gilliman, also known as the Avenging Sun, the Lord Protector, the Holy Regent, a few of his titles. He is one of two within current lore, one of two loyalist Primarchs in the setting, the other one being Lionel Johnson. He is the Primarch of the Dark Angels, which are the focus point of another game called Space Hulk Deathwing. But that's another game, so we'll talk about that another time. For this one, Ultramarines is Reboot Gilliman. They hail from Ultramar. Yes, very on the nose with the naming concepts. They are quite Imperial Roman, like kind of high Imperial Rome is their aesthetic, with laurels and wreaths and Titus, Acheron, Chiron. Very kind of like that naming concept and all that, right? Including like how their world is run, essentially. So if the aspirant survives the surgery, because that's another fail point, they might not survive. They might end up just dying outright, or horribly mutated in some form, in which case they become servitors. So nothing left to waste, right? So just to reiterate, because we went off on a bit of a tangent there, they've got to survive whatever they need to get to the Fortress Monastery or be chosen, right? Then they go under some pretty rigorous medical proceedings, including the implantation of something known as the gene seed, right? If they then survive this, right? If they don't outright die or get turned into a servitor because for whatever reason the surgery fails and their brains become just mush, yeah. They are then sent to the scout companies, right, where they learn how to be a space marine. Keep in mind that they might have the body, right, of a super engineered post-human genetic badass, but these guys, depending on how long the implantation process takes, they might be anywhere from a year older, right, because they're about 8 or 9 when they become when they decide to go there, or when they're chosen, right? They're about 8 or 9 when they start the process. When they survive, it might be a year later, it might be 2 years later, it might be a little bit longer. It depends on how long it takes for the gene seed and other organs to implant, right? So these guys, they're fucking like 10 at the time they become scouts. Now, this is not necessarily the way that each chapter does things. So various chapters have different methods for training their new Space Marines. This is kind of just a generic one, like very kind of codex. You hear that a lot, like codex compliant chapter kind of thing. The Codex Societies. This is all from memory, by the way. I don't have anything up either, so I could be horribly wrong. When this goes out to YouTube, comments correct me. But what are we at? So scout companies, right? They're scouts. It's very lightly armored Space Marines, and they might be in the scout company for a number of years. They might stay there. They might decide that is where they, or the chapter master in actuality would be the one to decide where they go from that. But they usually serve a number of years in the scout company before being sent elsewhere. So the scout company being the 10th company, each Space Marine chapter should, if they are Codex compliant, have 10 companies of 100 Marines, 1,000 Marines per chapter. The 10th is usually the scout company. The first company is usually the chapter master's bodyguard, or that's the one that they ostensibly lead. That is the first company is usually full of the longest serving Space Marines, right? Like that is veteran. The second company, to which Titus belongs to, is the second most senior company within the chapter, and like every single one has different specialities. You've got obviously companies dedicated to mechanical, companies dedicated to medical, right? And there are obviously specialized roles within everywhere else as well. So you've got chaplains, you've got Medicae. There's an actual name for them, I can't remember, but they're responsible. So the medics are basically responsible for either fixing a Space Marine up, or if they are unfixable, deciding whether or not to grant the Emperor's peace or entomb them within a sarcophagus, a dreadnought, right? Box on legs wielding gigantic weaponry. Alright. Gene Seed generally, by and large, gets reused. I believe there is a method in which they can grow more, but it is very slow, and chapters all do have to send off, at least in part, some percentage of their Gene Seed to storage worlds run and maintained by the Adeptus Mechanicus, so that if an entire chapter gets wiped out, the Mechanicus can reinstitute the chapter from scratch. All right. For the most part, Space Marine chapters are a meritocracy, so you get noticed for doing things. And if your brother captains or the chapter master feels like you might be the perfect fit for a role, you'll be approached. Now, in the case of Titus here, at least within his own personal lore, right? In the first game, he's the captain of the second company. Obviously, no longer. He's been replaced, but that's because of his rather long absence. And my goodness, everything is kind of... my computer's melting. Anyway, so he was a captain not because... he was pretty young when he was made a captain of the second company. And that was because the captain at the time, plus the captain's bodyguard, were annihilated by Eldar. From the little bit that I've read, right? So he was made a captain, and then obviously when he was taken off by the Inquisition, other Space Marines stepped up to the role or were put in the role. The current one, Captain Akaran, replaced one by the name of Cato Sicarius, who I believe is off gallivanting around the galaxy at the behest of the Primarch. I can't remember. It's been so long since I read anything to do with him. Cato Sicarius being one of the more fabled Ultramarines outside of Titus, Marneus Calgar, and another... starts with a V. I can't remember his name. Here we go. Uriel Ventress is another... Uriel Ventress being another captain of one of the companies. I forget which one. So there are a couple of storied captains within more recent lore, and I mean recent by way of the last 4 or 5 years. Could be older. So anyway, there is another process for firstborn Space Marines, which is what Titus was at the start of Space Marine 2 when he was fighting the Tyranids, when he was part of the Deathwatch company, or Deathwatch kill team rather. He was a firstborn. He's now been turned into Primaris, which is a whole nother set of surgical procedures. Again, potential to die, very high. Potential to survive, very small. Supposedly they're iterating upon the procedure to make it more successful, but who knows? All of this to say, Space Marines are not clones. Does that explain it well enough for you? Wombat with rectangular glasses. More like... you see the anime with the guy, the nerd with the glasses, and he pushes it up his nose and they flash. They're usually circular. Yeah, those. I would like a pair of those. But yeah, so Space Marines are not clones. They are very carefully modified 8-year-olds. The 41st millennium is a very dark, disturbing future, which I hope we never see. Because that would just be depressing. Depressing as shit. So, yeah. The service studs on Titus's forehead being 4 silver ones. I think they look gold. They might be gold. He's about 200 years of service. So that's from the time he enters as a Space Marine. Because you are essentially reborn to, whenever you get your next stud. Does that help? I hope that helps.